Welcome to today's event, Science, Technology, and War with Professor Susan Lindee from the University of Pennsylvania. We're going to be talking about her recent book, The Rational Fog, Science and Technology in Modern War. It's published by Harvard University Press, and you should go buy it right now. Susan Lindee is the Janice and Julian Bers Professor of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's been a visiting professor all over the world, including at Hiroshima University, which I'll explain why that's relevant in a second, as well as Associate Dean for the Social Sciences, where she was, unfortunately for her, my boss. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Professor Lindee. You are a world-renowned expert in helping us understand the way that science and technology help shape our world. So to start out, tell us a bit about your new book, The Rational Fog. What do we need to know?
Thank you, Mike. It's lovely to be here, and I'm happy to have this chance to talk about the book. The book began, honestly, as a series of lectures that I gave to undergraduates here at the University of Pennsylvania. I had written quite a bit about the atomic bomb because I wrote a book about the efforts to decipher the biological effects of radiation in the atomic bomb survivors at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and had been to Japan, had worked on how scientists were engaged with making sense of what had happened in those two cities, not just biologists, physicians, chemists, physicists, the whole suite of technical expertise brought to that city, or to both of those cities. And as I was teaching this course, I began trying to figure out how to think more productively about the history of this relationship between scientists, engineers, physicians, and military power. And initially, this was just how to teach a good course, how to help students understand it, how to give them some tools and some skills they might need. But then it became something I really wanted to share more widely, and that's what this book is.
Well, great. Well, let's get started in talking about some of the details here. And can you give our viewers, the book in many ways is about how defense research in some ways affects technological developments and in some ways the very complicated moral and ethical issues that surround those sorts of issues. So tell us a little bit about the book itself. And here's maybe one way to think about it. If our viewers here were to look around their homes, what appliances or technologies do people maybe have or use that actually might have military origins?
It's a fascinating question, and it's something I explore because it's one of the ways. I'm going to give you a quick summary of, if this is the right moment, I'll give you a quick summary of how the book is, what the book covers, what the intent of the book is, what its goals are. And this question of long-term downstream benefits of highly militarized science and technology comes up all the time in these questions of the impact and the meanings of militarized sciences. And it's something I try to think about. It's often seen as a way of calculating the ethical or the moral value of science and technology. And what I suggest right in the introduction is that's not the calculation I'm going to use, because the line I'm circling around in the book is titled Rational Fog. And the title is taken, it's borrowed from, first of all, a massive literature on the power of rationality and the rise of modern science, the meanings of modern reason, and how science has been commonly seen since the 16th century as the ultimate realization of rationality, the triumph of rationality over, I'll say, over emotion or irrationality. And the fog is from Karl von Clausewitz, who is in his 1831 book on war, Vom Kriege, said that a commander in the midst of war, in the midst of a battle, is engaged in something that is a fascinating combination of rational calculation and the confusion of fog and uncertainty, moving forward, never quite sure. Things are not quite what they seem. Clausewitz was influential in the 19th century, but even more influential by the 20th, and particularly by the mid-20th century, when his conceptions of what it meant to conduct warfare gained a new resonance or a new power, because Clausewitz said the ultimate goal of every battle is to completely destroy your enemy. And what he meant is not that that was a good goal. He meant that was that was in practice what you were trying to do. In the midst of the Cold War, with the rise of nuclear weapons, with the rise of thermonuclear weapons, the possibilities of the complete annihilation of your enemy, which might also come with the annihilation of life on Earth, made his words more powerful and more compelling. So what I mean to invoke in that title is this collision between confusion, uncertainty, the fog of war, and high reason, high rationality, the expertise of some of the finest minds who ever lived. And in some ways, the book is about how it came to be. It's a how book. It doesn't actually solve all the problems it raises, but it introduces these problems, and it asks, how did it come to be that the most brilliant people ever to be born came to orient their expertise around the production of human injury? So much military science is about how to maximize the amount of injury that can be produced by a given technological intervention. How do you make a bullet more effective? One of the ways you do this is by studying the shape and the speed, the velocity, and the spin of bullets using some kind of experimental organism. So one of the questions I ask is, why do we know the exact speed at which a bullet turns the brain of a cat to mush? And that's actually an equation, a calculation, which was developed at a Princeton University laboratory in the midst of the Second World War, where the goal was to figure out how to exactly make a perfect bullet. This is laboratory expertise. This is complicated. This is something, the equation can then be applied in other contexts. And so why do we know that? Why do we know exactly how much plutonium is required to destroy a city? And when you look at defense planning and military planning, all the calculations of how much plutonium would be needed, how large would the damage be, what exactly do you have to know to make this work? And also, this is strictly a Cold War 20th century problem. Why do we actually know the precise curve of the Earth, or the figure of the Earth? The figure of the Earth is a way of describing the actual geophysical nature of the curve, which was not fully understood until it became important for intercontinental ballistic missiles, when you had to know how to aim something a very long distance, and you had to know exactly how to make it curve. And so when I ask these questions, I'm saying, why do we know what we know? How did these become important problems? And my beginning sort of claim or assumption is it's not by magic. So many accounts of the rise of highly scientized, highly technological warfare, written by political and diplomatic historians. Some of those accounts are fabulous, but so many of them more or less say, and then the gun appeared, or, and then nuclear weapons changed the equation. And what I want to say is, the gun, the nuclear weapons, the chemical weapons, biological weapons, the submarine, tanks, industrialized warfare, they are as much a product of politics, money, social organization, cultural belief as any other element in modern diplomatic and political history, and they're just as important. And I would say the story I tell about the intersections between violence and technical knowledge is as important as the story of the rise of the modern state, or the creation of of global empires, or anything we normally characterize as diplomatic or political history. And so my story is about how expertise was, the shorthand is, how was expertise weaponized? How did it become something that, instead of being oriented around the welfare of mankind, or around improving the human condition, or solely oriented around improving the human condition, became oriented around figuring out how to do more damage, how to effectively destroy cities, destroy mental states. I have a concept I call dual use technology, or dual uses. And I don't mean the usual sense. What I mean by that is that when you know, here's the shorthand, when you know how to build a bridge, you know how to blow it up and bring it down. When you understand the full nature of an economy and economic system and how it works, you know how to weaken it, how to cause problems in an economic system. When you understand human psychology and what the mind needs to be secure and safe, you know how to undermine that feeling of safety. And one of the experiences that my actors had, often scientists, was precisely this recalibration of what they had discovered. So a chemist who figured out how to intervene in the production of leaves, probably in about 1938, in the leafing process, discovered that the army had taken up his discovery and was figuring out how to use it for defoliation, eventually in Vietnam with Agent Orange and the other agents. And so this feeling that no matter what you found out about nature, no matter what you understood about the world, it could be leveraged or reoriented to produce human injury, to produce damage. It could be militarized, even if that was not the intent. So part of the I wrestle with this question of militarized knowledge is that you can't put the knowledge in a kind of clear ethical category. It doesn't work that way. It's a how process. Things get recalibrated. They have different meanings. They can be used in ways that were not intended at all. Now, the book looks, I start with the gun because the gun came to Europe, roughly in 1320 and played an incredibly important role in European history, had a huge impact on European empires, and the gun is interesting too because it meant different things to different people. So when Native Americans had access to the weapons from Europe, they used them differently, and as they came to Japan, they were interpreted differently. So the gun is it's not just a simple technology that is an explosion that sends something through a fuse. It's a cultural object, and its consequences on the battlefield differ in different contexts. So I start with the gun. I turn to industrialization and the rise of industrialized warfare. I look at the First World War, which is usually seen as the first truly scientific war, partly because it's lab science in the First World War. This is high elite scientists, many Nobel Prize winners involved, and not just in chemical weapons, but in all the kinds of weapon systems that were important for the First World War. Then I turn to the Second World War, and then the global Cold War, the rise of nuclear weapons, but also what I call just the emergence of a totally transformed world. That is, it's a world remade because of nuclear weapons. That is, it's a global battlefield so that even the poles and the deep ocean and deserts and isolated islands all over the world get pulled into this competitive bipolar fight and literally geographically transformed underground, under the ice, in the sky, in the poles. And it's this geophysical transformation of the world that seems to me most compelling, or such a powerful way to understand what happened in the Cold War. Now, I have a couple of concepts that I want to briefly talk about, and then I'll turn it over for questions. One of the things I raise, I talk about what I call collateral data. And we usually think in warfare of collateral damage. That is, a city has unintended, that refers to the unintended consequence, for example, of a bombing run. But collateral data is the data that can then be extracted from that city. And it's particularly important in terms of bombing runs in the Second World War and the astonishing level of scientific study, which focused on the two atomic bomb cities, but also on other kinds of damage all over the world. So collateral data. I have involuntary consumers. In the history of technology, it's common now to say that if you want to understand a technological system, you have to think about the people who use it, who buy it, who want it for their own, and who apply it maybe in unintended ways. My involuntary consumers are the people in military weapons systems who are going to be damaged. And what I'm suggesting is that when you think about the consequences of the use or development of any technological system, any weapons system, thinking about the people on the ground or the people in the range of the gunfire, or the people who will be exposed to the chemical weapons, or the people who will step on a mine, thinking about the human beings who are a part of the system just as much as the developers, the consumers, the planners, the policy people. If we say, how does the system work? Those people on the ground whose bodies are affected by these technologies matter for our understanding of these technological systems as much as the people at the top. So they're involuntary consumers. And then the hidden curriculum is my borrowing of a term from educational theory, and my suggestion that once the technical expertise to be a scientist or an engineer or physician became so thoroughly embedded in military systems, experts had to learn entirely new skills, and they had to learn these skills. They wouldn't be taught the skills in, say, a laboratory or in a formal educational system. They had to learn them through the networks they were embedded in. So how do you keep a secret? What do you say in a security clearance hearing? How do you lie about what you're doing? How do you negotiate? So there was I call it the 20% solution. There was a kind of negotiation where physicists would say, I'll give 20% of my time to weapons technologies and to military problems, but I reserve the other 80% for the kind of science I really want to do, for the sheer joy of doing the science. So how do you calibrate how much you give to the security state and how much you withhold? So I guess my point is that the finest minds of the last 300 years have, to a significant degree, allocated their attention and their mental capabilities, their brilliance, their creativity to the production of human injury. And what I hope is that at least my book would make someone curious and puzzled by that fact.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is such a rich book, and I hope everybody sort of checks it out. And one of the things, building off of where you ended in some ways, you write in the book that, you just made this point that modern science was to some extent born militarized. Mm-hmm. And from the sort of richness of the stories you're telling here, it kind of makes me wonder, is there any science that's not militarized? And then, if not, is there a way to carve space for that? What is it, we can, once we recognize in some ways that this connection between science, the militarization of science that you very persuasively make, is there non-military science that we can do?
I used to have kind of a parlor game with my students, and I would say, name a scientific field and that you think could have no relationship to defense interests, to militarization, to the pursuit of war. And no matter what they named, I could come up with a project that defense had funded. You know that DARPA is the main funder of the brain mapping project right now. So all cognitive sciences, all social sciences, anthropology, archaeology, everything. There's no field of science which doesn't mean that everything that happens in these sciences is embedded in military purposes. It just means that modern warfare is knowledge warfare, and it is, there's not an easy way out. But what you could imagine would be limits on funding, or orienting funding around sciences that have an explicit beneficial purpose, as opposed to the purpose of producing injury. But I think you've raised a good question. It's not, once you have wars built on knowledge, then all knowledge is potentially useful. Remember, DDT was developed because of dengue fever in troops in Pacific Islands during the Second World War. DDT had been synthesized in 1878, but it didn't become important so it just sat there as a synthesized chemical. It didn't become important to war. And then initially it was as a lousicide in Europe because of the horrible problem of migrants covered in lice. And then in the midst of the Pacific War, it was applied to eliminate insect risk and therefore eliminate dengue fever in troops, dengue fever was a more serious barrier to the pursuit of the war in the Pacific than Japanese troops. So there's not an obvious way out. There are possible limits, but once war is conducted this way, the nature of war is different.
So another place in the book, you talk about the, I believe the phrase you use is the sort of moral disaster of the sort of techno-scientific, military industrial complex, essentially. I don't think I think I just used that in not exactly the way you used it, but you know what I mean, whatever. You know what I mean. Could you maybe expand a little bit on that and in the dilemmas that you think scientists have, and how how you think scientists should think about their moral and ethical roles in a world where, on the one hand, they want funding for their research. On the other hand, that funding might come from a defense enterprise that, even if the research they're doing is basic research, your work makes clear there could be violent consequences down the line, even decades later.
You have to admire many of the scientists who over the last 50 or 60 years have struggled so hard to come to terms with precisely that question. So what role can experts, scientists, engineers, physicians, what roles can they play in mitigating public policies, in affecting defense practices, in protesting? So for example, the psychologists, psychiatrists said that no, as a professional group, they said no psychiatrists should be engaged in torture and questioning prisoners using the tools of psychiatry in order to undermine their ability to function. And then the microbiologists came up with, for a long time, all the microbiologists had appointments, even the presidents of the microbiology society had appointments at Dietrich in the biological weapons programs, and it wasn't seen as forbidden, and then it became forbidden. So one possible, I guess, if we're going to talk about strategies, one strategy is well worn, is for professionals to try to make decisions that limit, that constrain what their members in good standing are supposed to do, that set models for proper moral behavior for someone with this kind of expertise. But I think your question is actually more profound, because what you're asking is, can scientists themselves stop this, somehow in their own research, prevent their research from becoming militarized? And it's probably not, it's not very easy. Norbert Weiner said that he's the cybernetician, mid-century cybernetician, who said, you shouldn't tell the Pentagon anything, because you are responsible for what happens with the knowledge you produce. And if you produce knowledge that makes it easier for the Pentagon to pursue war, then you have facilitated the war. Now, the problem he encountered is that when he did get requests for information, he had to admit that he'd already published several papers on it and they could read them. And so he'd say, you can read about this in my published papers. I'm not going to tell you anything. But this is, how do you stop it? How does and I'm very interested, as you probably picked up, in how the individual, and I include us in this group, how does the individual navigate the moral chaos, the moral disaster? Because one thing I say, and I tell my students all the time, we in the United States, and I include anybody who is at the University of Pennsylvania, this beautiful campus, this lovely school, this incredible place to be for all kinds of reasons, including intellectual, but also because of the excitement of all the people who come here. We are the beneficiaries of the military power of the United States. And we have all these resources, partly because of this military power. Remember, the United States is the dominant military spender in the world. And most recent budgets, the United States spends more on defense than the next 13 countries combined. So we are living in a superpower, and we benefit from that. And we can't, and I can't say, oh, I don't benefit from it at all. That's not true. I do. I benefit from the strong economy. I benefit from this beautiful city we live in, this beautiful campus, all the security and stability that makes possible. So one of the things, there's a beautiful essay by a science studies scholar, Donna Haraway, where she makes the point that we live in these such complicated technical systems that there's not an innocent place to stand. And it's better not to pretend that there is. It's better to say we don't have an innocent location. There's nowhere innocent. So.
Well, it's sobering, I guess. But I want to go back in some ways to the point that you made about, you know, the fun classroom exercise about, try to show me an area where there's no connection to the military. You have a question here that asks, does that fact in some ways challenge the epistemic status of scientific knowledge derived from military research?
Oh, that is such a great question.
Does it make our knowledge of the structure of like DDT, for example, any less objective? Does it, is it tainted in some way?
That is such a great question. And it's something that I talk about in the book. So we are at a moment, as you know, when anti-science propaganda, mistrust of science, disbelief in science as an effective way to gain true knowledge of the world is rising, and in some ways in very dangerous ways. And what I would suggest is that what the history of militarized science suggests, or what it shows, is that science, technology, and medicine are extraordinarily powerful ways to produce truth that acts in the world and that works with tremendous efficiency, that efficacy. If you want to criticize science and say it can't be trusted, why don't you look at a missile defense system, or look at things like the geology of burying radioactive waste, or any of the other knowledge domains implicated in defense interests. Now, the question you ask is slightly different. And what you're asking is, does the military interest in a form of knowledge taint the knowledge itself? And I would say it probably does not, at least not in the sense of epistemological legitimacy. I would say I've read a lot of Army records. I would say among the most intensively oriented institutions, intensively oriented around reliable and absolute truth, I would count the US Army, the Air Force, the Navy. These are institutions that care deeply about reliable, trustworthy, epistemologically justified knowledge. They pursue it. They throw out things that don't work, that aren't accurate. So we might say, I would say this about the nuclear weapons in general, that the knowledge itself is tainted by its consequences and by the immorality of using it. But it's not tainted in terms of its accuracy. It's absolutely accurate, astonishingly so.
So how should we, one more question about this, and then I'm going to start mixing in more audience questions. One of the things that in your answer to the last two questions made me think about is what the obligations of researchers might look like in different kinds of situations. And I'm imagining, for example, say today in the artificial intelligence field, there are questions about the role of faculty, and specifically sort of, and this is like a little like inside baseball academia, concern about faculty leaving academia to go work for tech companies full time, essentially, leaving its, like Penn, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, wherever, to go work for Google, for Facebook, for Amazon. So how should we think about some of those things? And I'm trying to like think through right now, like, all right, like a DARPA grant that funds your research at Penn versus, working for Facebook. Like, how do we, like adjudicate what your sort of obligations and responsibilities are like in some ways in light of that sort of 2080 story that you told, a few moments ago about, research that was going to spend, 20% of their time on military issues, and 80% on sort of the research that they want to do. How should we think about, essentially, I'm asking you to bring corporations essentially into the story.
Well, remember, corporations play a significant role in defense. Most actually Pentagon money goes to corporations that build technologies, build systems, build AI systems. The laptop grew out of an Army request, a specific Army request for a computer that could be used on the battlefield. And the Army said, build it so that you can market it as a consumer product, because that way it'll be cheaper for us. And so these technologies come from defense interests. They have different consequences. And you're asking me how you're asking how can an individual navigate these domains? And one of the things, let me just turn it around. Like, what if DARPA wanted to fund me to do more research on how to manage military systems and how to improve the way we think about their consequences and how to take into account all the forces that ought to be considered?
That sounds great, by the way. If anybody from DARPA is listening, Professor
I would
Lindee,
do that. I mean, you know, yes, exactly. If DARPA is listening, I would do that. I mean, I wouldn't say it's not don't take any defense money, and it's not don't work in private industry. Neither of those work. You know, neither of those are effective. So I don't have a good answer for you. And that 20 to 80% calculation is really an anguished calculation by physicists at the height of the Cold War, who discovered that absolutely everybody is building weapons. I mean, the physics community was hijacked by the arms race in ways that were alien to the generation raised in an earlier time, who had imagined themselves as engaged in some beautiful pursuit of an understanding of nature. And the romance of that way of seeing science was given up reluctantly and painfully by scientists at the height of the Cold War.
Well, thanks very much for that. And I want to sort of shift and start, mixing in audience questions. And, one member of the audience asked, Professor Lindee, can you talk about any examples of military technology in this context that have gendered consequences? How does gender play into the way that the military industrial complex is, thought about, weapons development?
It is so important that the entire system is shot through with questions of gender. And remember my comment about rationality versus emotion or irrationality. So there's a significant feminist literature that looks at how defense intellectuals made sense of how they talked about the consequences of the weapons systems they deployed. And the people, and my little comment about involuntary consumers is informed by my engagement with the feminist literature on science, technology, and medicine, and with feminist theory, which says people matter in all the different locations where they are. And some of this literature looks at the ways that when people were imagining nuclear war, anyone who raised the question of the emotional consequences of trying to imagine this future where everyone is dead, anyone who said, this is horrible, why are we talking about this, could be shot down because they were emotional. And the explicit removal of emotion, or I would put it this way, the delegitimization of emotions that have to do with caring, with being concerned, with engaging the world, with engaging the heart in the way that you think about science. That's an explicit part of the rise of modern science, which is seen as involving it is the labor of the mind, the brain, and the hand. So it's experimental labor, and it's the labor of thinking, and it's not the labor of caring. Caring labor will just confuse you. It will divert your attention from the core problems. It will, you can't worry about those things. You have to limit your attention to what's technologically possible and what kind of tricks your brain can do. And this is explicitly anti-feminist. And it associates emotions or caring labor with women. And, there's a literature too on why and how so many in the defense world so many people are male. It's not very open to women experts or to women expertise. There's a moment in the Cold War when women scientists are seen as less reliable because they are too emotional and they could easily be tricked by Russian agents. And so this idea that the female mind and the female, now remember, none of this is about what actual women or actual men do. Men and women all have emotions. The question is what roles are assigned and what roles are associated with the male and the female in the gender system, and how those associations could be and were used to silence concerns about the ethical implications of military technologies over and over again. It was girlish to worry about the consequences of any weapons system. It was emotion, and emotion explicitly seen as delegitimating and wrong. So I probably haven't exactly answered your question, but I would say actually my entire book is to some extent shaped by feminist perspectives on what it means to engage in human injury and what it means to eliminate calculations of caring labor, the three kinds of labor: the labor of the mind, the labor of the hand, and the labor of the heart. How did we get to a world where we leave caring labor out of the calculations of technologies and systems that produce massive, fundamental human injury? How did that become irrelevant to it? And, you know, every time you talk about engaging in warfare, I've read so many books about military technologies where there's no mention whatsoever of the injury to the people who will be affected. And I find it strange. And it's why is it not a part of the story that we tell? Why is it not relevant to our understanding of this enterprise? Every time you make that decision, every decision to go to war, every decision to drop a bomb, to launch artillery, to plant a landmine, whatever it is you're going to do, is essentially a moral calculation. And I think it would be good if we sort of recognize that. I can't be a complete pacifist. It's not logically possible for me, but I can say that when we calculate the consequences of these decisions, the people who will be injured, the caring labor should always be inside of it.
So we have a follow-up here that asks, you know, sort of not to be an essentialist, but could you maybe say a little bit about how having more female scientists, say, in the defense sector might have mattered, or, you know, might matter? And let me add to that the new Deputy Secretary of Defense of the United States is a woman named, you know, Dr. Kathleen Hicks, who I know a little bit, is incredible, like super smart. And, you know, how do you imagine that, you know, having more women in, you know, higher levels of the defense enterprise, you know, will that have an impact in some ways?
And what we know historically is that when women rise to these positions, they operate within the context of the culture of the position. So it's very difficult to rise if you're not willing to be appropriate for that culture. And I wish that it were that simple, that it were just a matter of, I totally support anybody highly qualified, smart, hardworking should be rising to a position of leadership. And I completely support increasing the number of women in all kinds of professional settings. I'm a diversity search advisor for the School of Arts and Sciences. I work to facilitate the employment of more women scholars across the school, and I believe in it. But I wish that I could believe that would actually transform the way that we conduct warfare. I think it's a selection element. And I also think that once you're in the game, you see how it works and you play the game. So this is the Carol, I'll just invoke this wonderful essay by Carol Cohn called Wars, Wimps, and Women, where she participates as a sociologist in war games. And she realizes that as the war game unfolds, her team, they make a kind of a strategic calculation to withdraw troops at some point. And the other team at the end of it in the final assessment calls her team wimps. And she says in this beautiful essay, she says, I've never been invested in not being a wimp, but when they called me a wimp, I was upset. and I could feel the insult underlying it. And part of the point of this essay is to say, once you're in this system, you understand the rules, you begin to see that if you act in certain ways, you will be delegitimated. If you raise questions about injuries, you will be seen as raising an inappropriate question. And we all learn in our professional setting what counts as an appropriate question and what counts as an almost forbidden question. So I don't think women alone can do it, but I do think attention to these questions. And I think, you know, there are many men in the defense system who have many of the same concerns that I've expressed. So it doesn't break along gender line, but the gender system polices these ideas and decides what will count. And the system, we're all in it, we're all playing.
So we have a question here that asks if you could maybe apply some of this to, you know, some of the analysis you've been, you know, from, you know, sort of concepts from your book to talk a little bit about COVID. And, you know, question wondering, you know, do you think the science behind the development of COVID-19 and the COVID-19 vaccine, sorry, not COVID-19, the science behind the development of the COVID-19 vaccine could be militarized in some way? You know, if so, how? You know, how much are you worried about that?
I would say I have some more immediate worries about the vaccine and COVID-19, but the question of whether it can be militarized, I think underlying that question is, can the virus be militarized? Not the vaccine, because the vaccine, I mean, I guess in theory, you could use troops are routinely vaccinated at an astonishing level. So in the Iraq War, they were Afghanistan exposed to massive numbers of vaccines in ways that made some people sick. Vaccines are great, but if you have too many at the same time and you're exposed to other environmental pathogens, you can get sick. I do think, well, we know that biological weapons are not only possible, they have been developed, and research is ongoing. It's usually framed as defensive research. In other words, the goal is to figure out whether particular pathogens could be weaponized, and if so, how, so that you can be prepared to defend. In the United States, you could defend US populations from these potential biological weapons. So I think that's what you're getting at. I'm not that worried about it. Biological weapons are they are a strategy disaster. The reason that biological weapons have not widely been used is because of blowback, because biological weapons, as we've seen only too clearly from the COVID-19 situation, once a powerful and dangerous form of pathogen is released, it can travel around the world, around the modern world, in no time. It can end up in many different cities and many different countries. And basically, there's no way or very few ways to protect your own troops or your own populations from any biological weapon that was let loose in the world. And so this kind of possibility of infection of your own troops and your own populations was recognized very, very early. It's too easy. They spread too readily. And so highly industrialized states maintain biological weapons programs. They call them defensive. There's not a lot of evidence, you know, after smallpox, Jeffrey Amherst sending the smallpox blankets to the Native Americans in Pennsylvania, I guess. There's not after that incident and a few other incidents where there's an effort to spread smallpox and injure people, systematic scientific biological warfare hasn't happened. And it's not, the reason it hasn't happened is not moral or ethical, it's practical and strategic.
So let me follow up. There's not sort of an audience question, but following up on the sort of notion of biological warfare, I think there's certainly no doubt that part of the motivation for the U.S. decision to abandon its biological weapons stockpile, for example, was driven by the fact that, well, in a world of nuclear weapons, you don't really need biological weapons, anymore. They're inferior weapons. At the end of the day, they're less accurate. They're, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think about chemical weapons in this regard? And you actually write about this a little bit in your, in your book. There does seem to be I would say, revulsion to the use of chemical weapons that, you sort of talk about in your book. There's an international treaty that's, more robust than the Chemical Weapons Convention is a lot more robust than the Biological Weapons Convention.
Yes.
How, are those sort of the moral attitudes of the world in some ways then shaping what militaries do?
Yeah, it's a puzzle. Chemical weapons are a puzzle, as you suggest, and they're a puzzle because we could call tear gas a chemical weapon. It's a chemical that induces, it makes you cry, and yet it's widely used. It's used domestically all over the world. It can be used even in the United States. It is against international law to use tear gas in war. And so the quandary becomes, why is it okay to use it in a domestic, some sort of unrest that you're dealing with, a demonstration? You can use tear gas against your own populations. In theory, you're not supposed to use it against an enemy state or enemy soldiers or civilians. The other quandary with chemical weapons is that many of those who were exposed to them in the First World War considered them preferable to machine guns. So to be gassed, mortality rates were relatively low for mustard gas and for most of the gases used in the First World War. They were 10%. This is not Tabun. This is not the post after 1920, the development of far more dangerous chemical weapons that could kill with a tiny dot. These were weapons that were painful and uncomfortable, but they didn't have a high mortality rate. And most importantly, for veterans, they didn't produce permanent scars and damage. That is, you were not mutilated. One of the things that I talk about in the book is drawing on all this literature on how and why chemical weapons continue to be banned and to be prohibited. And it's possibly that chemical weapons are scientific in a different way from, say, machine guns or even nuclear weapons. So they depend on a very sophisticated understanding of human physiology, and there's not an obvious defense against them. All those gas masks in the First World War, it was a constant struggle to try to get the gas mask to actually protect anybody. One of the best defenses was to have a dog in the trench, because dogs would smell the chemical long before the humans, and so you could get out of the way. But where was I going? So it's not, so the question is, and several scholars have raised it, why are chemical weapons banned? Because the other thing to remember is that chemical weapons range from something like tear gas that makes you run and cry to something that instantly kills you with a tiny dot. So it's not even a stable category of weapon. It's not, there's nothing, so you might say we can allow chemical weapons up to the level at which they make you go to sleep, or we could allow chemical weapons up to the level where they make you cough, but not where they kill you. So why is the whole category, which could in theory be effectively deployed under certain circumstances in ways that limited mortality, fatality, why is the entire category banned? And all I've been able to come up with, and this is a poor explanation, is that they're seen as uniquely scientific and uniquely, and that it's similar to the way that, there's a common comparison to insects. It's like killing the way that we kill insects. And so that makes it uniquely bad. But it's a very powerful convention. Any state that uses a chemical weapon against another signatory is going to face repercussions from everybody in the Chemical Weapons Convention. There's been a huge and very expensive effort to get rid of the chemical weapons that the United States has holding. As you know, there was a moment in the 60s when there was something called cut holes and sink them, which was the policy of loading up an old ship with all these chemical weapons reserves, taking it out off the coast of New Jersey or Maryland, and sinking it in deep water. With the premise in the 1960s seemed to have been that if the ocean was endless and you could just keep dumping stuff in the ocean with no repercussions. But anyway, so you raise a good question, and I can't fully answer it.
So another question asks, and we've got about about eight or so minutes left. Asks, we've got a couple versions of, is there a technology today you think will be as transformative as the gun was? And another asks sort of, is there a technology you worry about today?
Yes.
And I would add, and thus, what do you think we should do about it?
I worry about it, not just me. The Pentagon worries about it, and that's cyber war. And so that's the scary technology today. We are so fragile, so interdependent, so embedded in systems, in computing systems and information systems. And you might not have followed, I guess it was about 2 weeks ago, I think there was a water system that was contaminated in Florida, and it was understood, it was recognized, didn't last very long. They intervened, they caught it after about 5 hours. And what had happened is that somehow from a distance, someone, and it wasn't clear who, attempting to cause trouble, had manipulated how the water was being treated, such that if someone drank the water from that stream, from that particular moment, they could have gotten nauseated. So it was it's not mega cyber warfare, but they didn't understand who did it. Was it an enemy of the United States? Why did they attack this water system? But that's the reality. So a truly organized cyber war program could, systematically undertaken, literally shut down the whole United States, shut down the banking system, shut down the water systems, annihilate communication, the internet. And that's enough to create chaos. And it's just an entirely novel form of chaos. We could say some of the interventions in the election and some of the disinformation in the recent election is a sign of a kind of cyber warfare. It's a use of information warfare, propaganda, but mediated through the internet, mediated through cyber systems. And it's just an entirely new vulnerability. We're not talking about landing troops on the ground and taking over territory. The old models of warfare that came out of the 30 Years' War, those don't work anymore. That's the Westphalian Peace, and that said every state has sovereign power over its own country, its own territory. It's not appropriate for states to intervene in the territories of other states. What is the cyber territory? What kind of a space is this? And I think it's going to recalibrate the way we think about territory, the way we think about war. So far, there hasn't been a significant cyber warfare attack. I can't believe it's not coming. And I don't know what shape it's going to take, but it seems like that's where we are more vulnerable than we are in many other domains. I don't think anyone's going to land on New Jersey beaches, but I think the possibility of undermining the U.S. system by undermining through the internet, basically, I think it's real, and I think we're at huge risk.
Thanks very much for that. And I'm wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more. Let me push you a little bit in that, since at Prairie World House, a lot of our focus is on, bridging the gap between academia and the policy world. And so let me spin around in some ways one of the arguments, kind of some of the concepts from your book and ask, so suppose the Pentagon put you in charge of all funding of scientific research.
Oh my gosh, that'd be so much fun. I wouldn't know how to do it.
Absolutely, super fun. How would you think about how to prioritize? What to fund, what not to fund, and how to conceptually how to make those choices?
Number one, okay, so if the Pentagon is watching, number one, public health is a military issue and a massive public health system. And we've seen this. COVID-19 has weakened us as a nation, and the inadequate handling of COVID-19 is a huge problem on many different levels for social unrest, for suffering, but also for military security. And so I would say number one is public health is a defense issue and should be a top top priority. Number two would be something like every time we fund something, we are thinking about the broader long-term consequences of that system. Remember, a lot of what the Pentagon is funding is just the continuation of existing things. They build another airplane, they build another tank. Tanks are in they're constantly being upgraded. And those are systems that are, I won't say stable, but they're not going to be dramatically changed. But every time we fund a new system or a new idea, like say DARPA, if you're going to fund a map of the human brain, then you engage in the entire process with people who are maybe you don't outsource the ethics, but you have ethicists involved, you have historians involved, you have people who work on the rights of those who are mentally impaired or who have brain injuries. So you see everything you do in science is moves forward in a context that doesn't just make new knowledge the only thing that's important. So it's almost like I would try to figure out how to build caring labor into the Pentagon, into the science funding systems of the Pentagon. And you know, Mike, I'll invite you to come and join me now that I've got so much money running this defense industry.
Sounds very fun. And then to wrap up, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about now? I mean, it's the unfair thing to do, since every time I publish something, I'll call my mom and be like, hey mom, I published this thing, and my mom be like, oh, that's great. What are you doing now? And so let me ask you that the version of my mom question, which is like, all right, you've written this awesome book, like genuine, it's really cool. People should buy it. What are you thinking about now?
I have a couple of things going on, but I'll talk about the one thing that is my actual research project for now. And you will recognize in this project a slightly different focus, but it is about the Cold War. And it's about the creation of certain kinds of natural spaces as a result of Cold War international networks. And so I'm sort of interested in how scientists begin to take charge of national parks and nature reserves in what they would have called the third world, what we might call the global south, what I call the poor world, as they saw themselves as the overseers of nature in these settings. And so this is just a paper, it's not a book, but that's what I've been, specifically I've been looking at the creation of the field station in the scientific field station in 1962 in the Galapagos Islands. Remember, the Galapagos Islands were really not protected until the Cold War. There was an Army air base on the Galapagos Islands in the midst of the Second World War. And so I'm sort of interested in how space is transformed by these global tensions, bipolar tensions, including spaces understood to be uniquely natural.
Thank you very much. I think you just made Professor Michael Weisberg, who has been working with us here at Perry Worldhouse and who does work, leads some Penn efforts in the Galapagos, very, very happy just to hear the shout out.
I've gone to work with him in the Galapagos, so I'm one of the people who's gone down with him.
Awesome, very glad to hear it. And so thank you so much for sharing these insights and taking the time to join us for this event today. We really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to chat and work with you. And thanks to our audience for joining us for this edition of The World Today. And we hope to see you next week for our next installment of The World Today, the second in our series on worst case scenarios. We're getting kind of grim. Maybe it's a reflection of the world this semester. And we'll have a former Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, and President and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Rachel Bronson, on to talk about the threat of nuclear war. We'll drop a link to register for that event in the chat. We'll also drop another link to Professor Lindee's book, which we hope you'll all check out. And as always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel, and you can find out about all the great events we have planned for next semester by following us on a variety of social media platforms at Perry Worldhouse. Thanks everybody for being with us today, and thanks especially to Professor Lindee for writing a really interesting book and for a fun conversation.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.